courage can take on many forms. We're all familiar with the gallant knight slaying dragons on a noble white horse. In fact, this is often how we see ourselves in our own story. Brandished sword raised high, riding into battle without fear. There certainly is a time and place for this kind of courage, and each of us should be ready to display it when we are called upon to do so. Yet, there's another kind of courage. A steady, workaday courage found in holding tightly to what is true, even if the world around us seems to be screaming to believe something different. Yet screaming is often not the tactic of our enemies. Screaming only happens when they realize that you, in fact, will not give in. No. Before the screaming is a sweet, sticky serenade of pleasantry meant to lull us into a false sense of peace and security. That world you say you believe in? It's only a dream. There's nothing but matter in motion, cause and effect. Even the God you say you worship is only a projection from your psyche of a deep-felt desire for the protection you lost after you realized that your father or mother was unable to protect you from the cruel realities of the merciless, barren, and chaotic universe we live in. Just enjoy your life and pursue any experience, because that's all you have in the end. This is the siren song of materialism, a dark enchantment meant to cover the rich and magical world created by the one true God. This kind of tactic takes that other kind of courage. Not the kind of courage to run in with a sword, but the kind to put your foot on a flame and make the pain shock you back into reality. The kind of courage found not in a knight, but in a marsh wiggle. Today, I talk with Joe Rigney about his book, Live Like a Narnian, and how we can recognize and break the dark enchantment that has hidden the truths of God's glory all around us, and how C.S. Lewis hides this all in plain sight in the land of Narnia. Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber, and back again with us since his premiere debut in our first episode, Titanomachy, is Jim Parkin. Say hi to everyone, Jim.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thanks for being with me tonight. For folks listening, this is a little bit different than probably what you're used to, especially because you saw the title of the episode and saw that I was going to be talking to Joe Rigney, and here I am talking to Jim. The reason why is because Jim and I were just going to do kind of a little preview, kind of prepare you for that, talk about some things that we thought were interesting or good, or things that we think you ought to be listening for in the interview. But I thought I'd just start things off and ask Jim. Jim, have you ever done a pre-show before?
I have not. This is my maiden voyage.
Well, it's mine as well. So if it's terrible, everybody, that's why, because Jim and I don't know what we're doing here yet. But hopefully it's helpful and kind of primes the pump, if you will, for everybody before we jump into the interview with Rigney. So, Jim, without giving away too much of the interview, I sent it to you earlier on. You've had the opportunity to listen through it. What was there anything particular that you thought was helpful that you think people should listen to?
I think one of the things that Rigney is going to bring out in his interview with you, and something that really is kind of the secret sauce of C.S. Lewis, because we know Narnia, we know Screwtape Letters, we know Miracles, we know Mere Christianity. But I think something that he kind of obliquely references in your interview together is, he doesn't bring it out directly, but it really comes from the last work Lewis ever published was The Discarded Image, which is ultimately his attempt to kind of write more or less a cipher to understand medievalism and by proxy the ancient world as well. So, Lewis was a deeply studied medievalist, and especially when it comes to the cosmology that they understood, which is something probably more foreign to us than even going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Like, we could probably have a more straight shooting conversation with Plato than we could perhaps with like Dante or Aquinas. because in the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance especially, there was such a different understanding of the way the cosmos worked, where we are, who we are, how we interact with things above us and below us. Where are we in the universe? And so when Rigney is talking about, especially Michael Ward referencing Planet Narnia, which will come up plenty in the interview, and especially the poem that Lewis wrote about the planets, not in the sense of we know there are celestial bodies floating out there made of lots of mass and density in our solar system, but the kind of not even the zodiac meanings, but the kind of classical or post-classical meanings of these planets as personalities, as emotions, as centers of various power, and symbolism. That was very big in the medieval mind. And it's very easy for us to read even his poetry, which does say a lot about Narnia, and miss the significance because we don't have a ready-made category for that. So the discarded image is super helpful. It's definitely a more scholarly work than a lot of other things that Lewis wrote. And again, I think it was the last thing he ever published before he died. So it's kind of his swan song. But I think he was trying to go down with the ship and say, hey, if I'm going to leave any legacy here, here's what these great thinkers and lovers were talking about in the medieval era, the Middle Ages, and why we need to make sure we try and reclaim it and not keep it, quote, discarded.
Yeah, that's good. We definitely talk about that. And you're right. He does kind of like touch on that, but didn't go real deep into it.
He doesn't go full bore there, but
Hmm.
I think that's what is in the back of his mind as
Yeah,
we talk about it. Yeah.
definitely, definitely. So, well, that's good to know too, and I appreciate kind of the little synopsis there. I know that you and I have chatted about potentially talking about that sometime. So, don't want to make any commitments there, but that sounds like it would be a lot of fun to talk about. So, um, yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things that I thought that he brought out, at least caused me to ask some questions, right? Um, was this idea of the work that we're all doing right now, not so much as a re-enchantment work, um, but actually seeing modernism and like Enlightenment thought as like a dark enchantment. I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to give too much away because we talk a decent amount
Yeah.
about that in the episode, but it really got me thinking, if that's the case, if re-enchantment isn't the right language to describe it, and you can use different words and kind of mean the same thing, but if we want to be accurate and use, more precise language, I suppose, around the work that we're doing, like what does that shift look like? So let me ask you, what do you make of the shift he proposes in thinking of the phrasing of re-enchantment rather than calling it re-enchantment, really just discovering things the way that they are, you
Yeah.
know. Yeah, and this will make a little bit more sense when you listen to the episode. So, but um, yeah, what do you make of that shift?
Yeah, I think it was interesting, especially in the sense that I think as I can continue to think more deeply about topics like these and kind of bigger paradigms in which we live, I realize that, if you take a absolute, like beyond the 40,000 foot view, you go all the way out, full zoom, and see that if we do claim that Christ is king over all things, and thus anything arrayed against him is kind of an antithesis, not in a dualistic sense, not as though anything can compare or compete with our Lord, but that it's either basically you love and worship Yahweh or you don't. Those are the two categories. And so I'm thinking with what is brought up in this conversation that it's more helpful to see that there's no neutrality at any time, at any point, anywhere. So there isn't, like, materialism and modernism, for instance, aren't just kind of secular ideas. They're evil ideas. And so if we're looking at the fact that Rigney supposes there is no de-enchantment or re-enchantment, there is just successive enchantments, I think that actually makes sense. I don't know that I would commonly use that language myself, but I can get where he's coming from in the sense that everything is a kind of a charged medium where we interact, where we think, what we do. And ironically, since the conversation is about Lewis, I do think about the screw tape letters where so often, it's like the best ploy we have is to convince everybody that we're not pulling any strings. It's also like Kaiser Soze's famous line from The Usual Suspects. The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing people he didn't exist. And perhaps that's exactly what is going on with the quote modernist or materialist enchantment. It is a spell cast on everybody so that we do not realize there is a spell cast on everybody. At the risk of sounding, a little maybe too woo there, that is, I think, a valid point. And I think that's what Rigney is getting towards. And he teases that out very well. I've not ever thought about it that way, but it is very helpful to realign terminology and again to consider that there is no neutrality. So it's not like we had a good thing and then we went to kind of a null state, and then we had a bad thing and then we want to come back to a null state to go back to a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be one or the other. There really
Right.
is no interim.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't really get into it in this story. And he doesn't get into it in the context of this story in the book, but it's kind of like in Narnia, in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where most people actually met Narnia and
Right.
everything, right? The problem isn't that it's not enchanted. The problem is that it is enchanted by a white witch who makes it always winter and never Christmas. And Aslan has to come break that enchantment. So, yeah, it certainly was kind of paradigm shifting for me. I'm still not totally sure what to do with it. As I was telling you before we started recording, I'm actually talking with Glenn Sunshine about Christmas, ironically. And we're having that conversation. We're recording it this Monday. It's going to be coming out in December. So part of
Excellent.
sort of like an Advent season. We've got a couple
Mhm.
episodes, one with Glenn Sunshine, and then I'm going to be talking about um, Doug Wilson's book, God Rest You Merry, and a couple of chapters in there. It's real similar to this episode today, but as sort of like a two-part Christmas series to end off this season. So, and then we'll have a big break in January. So there was another piece there that I know we had talked about doing this, and you were like, "Ooh, I have this cool touch point with the thing." So, as you mentioned, Rigney talked about this book, Planet Narnia, in his interview. You have a little bit of a story with Planet Narnia, right? So why don't you give us your little special bona fides there, I suppose.
I do. And it is something that in retrospect, I realize I wish I could do this over again now instead of when it happened, because I was such like an uninitiated novice at the time. But when I think I was a freshman in college, I had the opportunity to take a travel trip for kind of an English humanities class abroad. And we went to England. We were in London and Cambridge and Canterbury and Oxford. And I got to go to the kilns, which is where Lewis with his brother Warren lived together for years as mutual bachelors, which included like all the ceilings and upper walls were yellow because they smoked so much in that house that if walls could talk, they'd be wheezing and dying from lung cancer. So there was so much nicotine literally seeped into the plaster. It was wild. Which includes the story that the guide there had told us, where every day C.S. Lewis and his brother Warren would take a daily constitutional swim, which meant they would walk into the pond behind the kilns, which would come just about up below the shoulders, and they'd stand in the middle of the pond and then smoke for an hour in the pond, and that was their swim that they took every day. So that just always cracks me up. But while we were there, and again, this is where like I just did not appreciate what I had at the time, but Michael Ward came to the kilns and gave a presentation to us in person on Planet Narnia. I
Oh,
actually think, Coleman, I don't know that the book was even released yet. It was like a manuscript review that he
hmm.
was teaching, because the professor that was the head of our trip was a good friend of Michael Ward, because she
Hmm.
herself was also a Lewis scholar at Grove City where I went. So they had this connection, and so it's kind of like pearls before swine. I'm sitting there like, I don't even know who this guy is. I haven't read Narnia for 15 years. Why do we care about this? But it was tremendous, and that was the first time I ever knew about Lewis writing that poem about the planets, because that's a big crux of Ward's argument. And I went home and I read it. And then I remember listening back through Gustav Holst's suite on the planets. Beautiful orchestral pieces,
Hmm.
Mars, the bringer of war, Jupiter, the bringer of peace and jollity, and all these things. Again, kind of in the same vein of how Lewis was writing about these, and almost more, not maybe it's too low of a term, almost like more astrological terms of how
Hmm.
we view, in a kind of a mythic sense, the planets in the solar system, and really kind of fell in love with this idea. So I didn't appreciate it as it came to me, but it really prompted me to go and dig into this deeper understanding of what C.S. Lewis was doing, why Narnia has far greater depth than we think, and how that makes a great bridge into his Ransom trilogy as well, when he's directly interacting with, quote, the planets in his own narrative.
Yeah. Well, that's good. It's funny. I think all of us have had those moments where we don't realize what we had until we
Yep.
had it
Yep.
later, right? So, but that's fun. That's a fun connection. So, well, hey everyone, we hope that you enjoy this interview with Joe Rigney. We've got sci-fi and fantasy, discussing the differences there. Talk a little bit about magic. Um, Joe Rigney talks about casting a spell. I'm not joking. Um, so I don't know how that's gonna play back in Moscow. Yeah, but that's what we got. So hope you all enjoy it, and we'll talk to you later. Talk to you later. I don't even know what that was. I'm just gonna cut it. I'm just gonna cut
We
it
won't
because
actually talk to anybody
everybody's
later
gonna
because it's a podcast, but
right,
fair.
right. Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber. I'm one of the elders at Proclaim Church in Bonner Springs, Kansas. Today, joining me is Dr. Joe Rigney. Joe is a professor at New St. Andrews. He's one of the ministers at Christ Church in Moscow, right? Not Moscow, Moscow,
Correct.
Idaho, and author of many books, including the one we'll be discussing today called Live Like a Narnian. And if you're watching this, and I do a video this time, this is what it looks like. It's a great book. Joe, anything else you want to say to folks to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I think I may or may not be descended from King Loon on my father's side. So
Oh, that's awesome. That's regal.
that's right. That's
So
right. Yeah.
great.
Oh, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Fun little note about our community. We've got a Discord that's pretty lively. And we have some folks in there who have kept their own identity secret. But apparently they know you from your time at Bethlehem. So
Oh,
maybe we can
okay.
talk some other time, and you'll
Yeah,
help me figure
yeah.
out who they are. So
Who
it's
they
fun.
are, out them. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
No,
doxing folks. So
that's right.
not on the podcast though. So awesome. Well, hey, you obviously wrote a whole book dedicated to the treasures of, I'm going to use a word here, of the enchanted world of Narnia.
Okay.
Why do you think Narnia is so loved today?
I think that Lewis knew how stories work. I think as a kid he loved stories. As he grew up, he has a very robust and potent imagination, and he just soaked himself in books. And so um, he knew how the mechanics of storytelling worked, and as a Christian, had a story worth telling. So there was a worldview or a framework that could produce great stories. He'd recognized, kind of through his conversion, that a lot of the stories that he loved were all written by Christians, right? So he loved George MacDonald, Fantastes Baptized His Imagination. He loved Dante and Milton and those sort of things. And it was sort of like the common thread was these are all Christians who were excellent in their craft. And so having steeped himself kind of in that fairy tale and literature world, he was just really, really able to write good stories with and knew how, I think, particularly like kid stories worked. Like the things he talks about this in a couple of places. There's certain things, if you're writing for a particular audience, that you just can't touch. You don't go into it. And that actually, those kind of boundaries actually enable you to do some really good stuff, as opposed to feeling like you're trying to hit all marks, and therefore it doesn't have any center or any coherence. So I think that's a big part of it. I also think that there's something, I'm a fan or a advocate. I don't know what the word is. Michael Ward's stuff on Planet Narnia, I think, is spot on, and so I think Lewis's ability to kind of capture the ambiance, atmosphere, environment, qualities of the medieval planets he was really successful at that. And so I think those, maybe today we'd say he caught the vibe of the planet and was able to communicate that in certain ways that I think really resonate. So that's why people feel like, yeah, there is a coherence to these stories. There's it's a set, and yet you're like, yeah, but there's a different feel to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe versus Horse and His Boy. Like there's something different. What is that? And I think that variety actually draws people in.
Yeah, that's great. I've not read Planet Narnia, which is like, to my shame.
Yeah.
But
Gotta get it.
but it's on my list of things to read. I know that generally, conceptually, for at least the people who don't understand what it is, the idea is that each of the Narnia books corresponds with one of the planets in like the medieval view, right?
Correct. Yeah. So the medieval heavens had certain qualities associated with each of the planets. The medieval worldview sort of was like Jupiter is like this, and it had certain qualities associated with Mars is different. Often it's tied into, in some ways, the is sort of the medieval Renaissance view of those deities. So Jupiter versus Mars versus Venus. But there's certain qualities associated with each planet. Lewis wrote a poem called "The Planets," in which he tried to kind of in Anglo-Saxon, the form of the poetry is Anglo-Saxon, but kind of tried to capture that. And if you read the poem and then you think about the books, all of a sudden you start to go, oh, wait a minute. And so Ward basically spends, he's written now 2 books on it where he argues and tries to show the correspondences both from that and he draws on space trilogy as well, because you see some of the same kind of atmospheric quality stuff. And that this is actually this is one of the main things Lewis is doing, is trying to recover these qualities through these stories.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to read it and start trying to figure out how they all interact myself. So I'm sure, like that's exactly the kind of thing that Lewis would do is, right. Frame a whole series around
and not tell anybody
medieval cosmology.
He never, like, the big objection to it is that like Lewis never said he did this. There's no letter that he wrote to someone who was like, hey, guess what I'm doing? Like, there's none of that. It's just an entire, and Ward actually makes the case, he's like, yeah, that actually is the sort of thing he would do, is like do this thing that would be really important to him and then like never tell anybody.
Yeah, he'd be the kind of guy who would like chuckle about it on his deathbed and go like, I made it. Didn't tell anybody.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, let's jump into your book a little bit then. And, in particular, I want to start out by not talking about chapter 1, but there are a couple of chapters I think are really pertinent that people that listen to our podcast would be really interested in. So chapter 6 is titled The Folly of Nothing Buttery. It's always more than meets the eye, which I did catch the Transformers reference, by the way. So,
okay.
you're not as sneaky as you think.
Okay.
Why don't you tell us a little bit, without, just reading the whole chapter straight, about Eustace, Ramondu, what Nothing Buttery is, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Nothing Buttery, I think, is a term. I think I got it from Doug Wilson. I don't think I got it from Lewis, but it's the ideas in Lewis. Because I think Doug got it from Lewis. But the idea is that it's reductionism, scientific reductionism, which basically seeks to reduce reality to its material components. So, you're nothing but a bag of protoplasm. You're nothing but a sack of cells. All we are is matter in motion, and we kind of do this. So, and then we do it with not just sort of physical entities like we are, but also like love is nothing but a chemical reaction in your brain. And so it's that nothing but is the reductionism, and it's what Eustace does in Voyage of the Dawn Treader when he says, in our world, a star is a ball of flaming gas, is nothing but a ball of flaming gas. That's all it is. Whereas in Narnia, it's a person, and And then Ramondu basically says, even in your world, my son, that's not what a star is, just what it's made of. And so that distinction between what something is and its sort of what it's made of, that's its matter. Like that is part of it. That is part of what it is, but that's only part. Um, and so I think Lewis is very much. This is kind of like one of the major themes in his writings, both fiction and nonfiction, is to kind of blow up this nothing buttery. We shouldn't do it's merely, that's all it is. He's like, that's not it. Because it plays into that kind of scientific scientistic worldview that thinks the only things that can be real are things that can be measured with a microscope. And how do you do that with the soul or with reason? And this is what I think Lewis realized. His argument from reason is really that's the target. Is that if reductionism is true, there's no way you could know it to be true because the word true doesn't mean anything at that point.
Yeah.
Because he was regularly quoting this guy, a scientist named Haldane, who said if my thoughts are just the product of atoms in my brain, then there's no way that I could know that there are atoms in my brain because it's just environment, like brain burps. Your brain burped. And so, and why are you acting like that has more significance than a burp? So, so he's at war with that. And then, so he's weaving that into the story by sort of saying, Eustace, fittingly, right? Educated in the wrong sorts of schools, reading the wrong sorts of books, would naturally lapse into that. And that Lewis is then saying, no, that's not the way the world is, even in our world. This isn't just a fairy tale Narnia thing. Even in our world, the stars are more than just balls of flaming gas.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how he contrasts the different kinds of character that those presuppositions produce too. I mean, that's how Eustace starts out. Obviously, if you've read the books, spoiler for the Narnia series, right, if you're listening to this podcast. But Eustace kind of starts out just having been steeped in that idea, and like he's just kind of an awful person.
Yes, he's the worst.
And I think that's pretty accurate in my experience as to what that sort of mindset will produce. One of the terms that we see tossed around, at least kind of if you're following people on Twitter and things like that, or X or whatever you call it, is school marm. It's like school marmery in its nascent form. Like it will turn into just like constant berating over and nitpicking over just little insignificant details.
Right. Yeah, you miss the forest for the trees, that kind of thing, where and I think for Lewis, it's like, it's not, he's always adamant. It's not what they affirm that's the problem. It's what they deny. So, yes, a star is made up of, flaming gas. That's true. Mm-hmm. It's then don't use that true thing to deny other true things that stars say have angelic intelligences behind them or people, right? Which is part of the way the Bible talks, right? So,
right.
Are the hosts of heaven? What are the hosts of heaven in the Bible? And it's like, well, on the one hand, there's plenty of passages where you could say, yeah, they're stars. Like, yeah, they are. And then other times it's like they're angelic armies, and we're meant to sort of not see that as, well, it's either one or the other, and we just have to pick which passages teach that. It's that there's some kind of unity to both of those ideas. This is part of what Lewis is doing in the Space Trilogy, for example, is kind of trying to recover that notion that angelic intelligences are doing stuff out there, and so we shouldn't reduce things to their material measurable components.
Yeah, that's good. So that kind of leads me to my next question, but still on the same idea. If we recognize that the nothing buttery attitude is not really biblical, it seems as though the world outside the church, with exceptions to this, but it seems like kind of at least in the realm of like the common man, if you will, they have started to dump the nothing butteriness of like enlightened materialism. Yep. Do you think that's true? Do you think the church is ready for that? Or are we stuck?
Yeah, no, I think that there is a sense in which sort of the bankruptcy from a meaning significance kind of standpoint, is leading people to go, there's got to be more there, and they intuitively know that there is. And so that like a strict scientific materialism still does live on in certain places, um, but doesn't have the same punch that it did, say, in Lewis's day among educated folks, or even like the new atheists. So like the new atheists all would be kind of in that nothing buttery camp, right? So Dawkins is just going to reduce everything down to the selfish gene or whatever. And it's like those guys still have a following. There's still that kind of atheist out there, but they don't have the same pull. It's much more you're likely to find kind of a resurgent. I don't want to say paganism exactly, because I think that's too generous to what it is, but it's almost like a pantheism,
Hmm.
where there must be some kind of like life force in the soul, and so all of that kind of stuff, usually with a kind of a self-help flavoring. I think that's just a much more kind of default assumption. And then people can Christianize that to one degree or another. So that, yeah, I believe in God, but their version of God that they believe in is some kind of force that doesn't, and Lewis, again, is real helpful. I think he anticipated this. Mere Christianity talks about life force religion as sort of like the biggest example of wish fulfillment ever, because it gives you all the buzz of religion. When you're walking outside and the sun's shining and you want to feel like there's something more than matter in motion, you can feel like there's this great current of force carrying you along, and you're a part of it, and it's in you and through you, and that makes you feel warm and fuzzy. But then later that day, when there's something that you want to do that's not quite ethical, right? That life force isn't going to stop you. That life force doesn't care.
Mhm.
Um, so it doesn't have the boundaries that sort of traditional religion would. And so he's like, this is super convenient. You get all the benefits with none of the drawbacks. And he says, this is actually the kind of projection wish fulfillment that Christians are often accused of. Um, uh, and so and he thinks pantheism, vitalism, that kind of thing is a real possibility as a kind of uh, improvement or reaction to uh, the scientific material reductionism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think that there's been somewhat of an awakening to that within the church as well. And there's certainly a lot of groups, like I know the Sword and Staff has been kind of working in this space since like 2020. I know the Han and Cosmos guys have been doing things since around 2023, that sort of thing. Um, and there's certain degrees of like agreement, or the words that we like to use are like hinged or unhinged takes and things like that. But I think at the heart, what we're all trying to do is like get people to take seriously that maybe you've imbibed a little bit of the nothing buttery, and there's like a whole like wellspring of people that are coming up that have totally rejected that. They don't know what they're doing, but like there is a ripe harvest here. And that's what podcasts like ours are trying to do, is actually talk to folks who have just denied that materialism is it. And we want to take people seriously, where oftentimes they just kind of get laughed out of the room and things like that. But
Right. Well, and it's important. This is another place where Lewis, I think, anticipates the problem. Is in like in Paralandra, when Ransom and Weston are having their kind of debate on the beach, Weston says, they're kind of talking past each other a little bit, and Weston says, "Well, don't you worship God because he's a spirit?" Like, we're saying the same thing, and Weston is basically advocating for some kind of weird pantheism, life force thing. And don't you worship God because he's a spirit? And Ransom's like, absolutely not. We worship him because he's good.
mm,
Like, there's spirits and there's spirits, man. There's spirits and there's spirits, man. Like,
yeah.
like let's not. And then Weston totally rejects this, and he's like, no, no, no. What you call God and devil is really just two names for the same thing. One sort of calling us forward with our aspirations, and one driving us behind with the fear of punishment. But it's all the same thing. And then he's like, I call that spirit into myself now. And then he gets possessed by a demon, right? So it's like you don't. He's like, you're playing with things because you've kind of gone, hey, the world is not just matter and motion. There's more to it. And then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, but you're playing with fire, and this is handle with care. It's not a game. And I think Lewis recognized that that path, people would take that path.
Yeah.
I think he even knew people who kind of really got into various kinds of like theosophy or anthroposophy, like whatever Barfield was.
Hmm.
Like Lewis could like kind of have some sympathy for it, like, but also um, psychical research and like, do we survive after death and ghost stories and all that kind of stuff. Like he knew that like there are people who are really going to get into that,
Hmm.
and he was like, "This is not that, ain't it?"
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think the way that we see that today, and I mean, they'd make the claim that this is very, very ancient stuff, and in some ways it is. But sort of the folks who are like generically esoteric, um, or involved in some sort of generic paganism sort of deal, they talk often about exactly what you're talking about, where they're kind of making the claim that, hey, we're all reaching the same thing. We're all going for worshiping the same thing, but they talk about it in the terms of like right and left hand paths and things like that. And well, when you embrace the darkness, you're just embracing the left hand path and you're going that
Yeah.
way. And then there's really weird things like, say like atheistic Satanists who are like, oh, we embrace the philosophies of the left-hand path. And it's like, okay, well, you're doing the things where the atheists who want essentially a Christian culture are doing,
Right.
except for you're just doing it the opposite direction and
Yeah.
denying like that spiritual reality too. So,
Yep. Yeah. And when and in Screw Tape, Lewis talks about this because he says, you know, the Screwtape and Wormwood are discussing sort of the demonic strategy for the 20th century, basically. And Screwtape says, that's been set. We're concealing ourselves. There are ages where we don't conceal ourselves, where we manifest, right? So you can, ages when demons manifest as gods who demand worship. He says, that's not the strategy. We're concealing ourselves. He said, and he kind of held up this possibility. The best case scenario would be if we can create the materialist magician.
if you are enjoying this episode of Sword and Staff Revenant and want to support the show, then you can head over to swordandstaff.creator-spring.com. We have shirts and mugs in multiple colors, stickers for all of you laptop graffiti artists out there, and even a pint glass for your favorite brew. You can support the show and get something for yourself as well. Links in the show notes and on social. Thank you for your support.
The best case scenario would be if we can create the materialist magician, right? The person who basically worships spirits, but under the name of powers or forces.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a scientific element. It's a materialism, but rejects the existence of spirits. He said, because if we can get that, then that's like the best of both worlds, right? Well, on the one hand, we're actually receiving the worship and reverence that's due to God, and so in that sense, it's more of the magician, who's trying is Dr. Faustus, and then on the other hand, he's like, but this is a scientist, and I think in that hideous strength, that's what Lewis is trying to show with kind of Frostwither and the upper echelons of the NICE, where they've kind of scientized demonology, right? They call them macrobes in order to communicate that it's like microbes, but they operate on a higher level. They're intelligent. So it's like and Lewis is recognizing that the line between he actually has some places I think it's in Paralander actually, where he talks about the supernatural, and there's sort of two buckets. On the one hand, you've got kind of God, angels, devils, the religious form. And even within that would be things like ghosts and other classic things like that. And then on the other hand, there's like aliens and that sort of realm. And he's like, the modern mind has a line that separates those two. And we even see it in our kind of genre classifications, science fiction versus fantasy, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, there's no line. And it's like, and then Lewis is kind of playing with that and saying there is no line there. It's just the world. And then he does comment like it's a really comforting line for modern people. Like modern people really like that clean line between like, oh no, science fiction is it's scientific, it's materialistic, there's aliens. If there's things that would look like it's magical powers, it's just really advanced technology.
Yeah.
And so we all know the mechanisms. And that's totally different than fantasy, which has this other quality to it. And Lewis is like, yeah, that's not it. Like, this is just the world.
Yeah. Joe, we got to get you going down the UFO rabbit hole, man. One of these days.
I mean, I'm with the Tonic Cosmos guys. It's like, it's just demons. This is the modern form of what demons do.
If we take demons as like a nice
The general,
generalization of bad spiritual things, then that's
yes,
fine.
dark,
But
dark spiritual powers. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, that distinction between sort of, if it's fantasy or science fiction, and I think a lot of it has to do, like, is there explainable mechanisms there? Like, does it have metal? That sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Right.
I was uh thinking about, like, the Transformers movies recently, in the second of the new ones, right? Which are not good movies. I made the mistake of remembering that it was good from when I was younger and foolish, and then I watched it and I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta, like, make my sons turn their head like every 5 seconds, right?
Yeah. Right.
But in the second one, they have this concept of uh like there's this really big bad transformer, and he had a machine that he hid inside the pyramids. Things like that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
like the kinds of things he's doing looked very magical. And I was like, man, like, even in the modern mind, something comforts us about seeing this happening by some sentient machine. But
Yes.
like, there's fundamentally no difference between these things. Even the story is so similar. It's just, there's fundamentally no difference. So,
Right. It does. Yeah. So like you said, if is there metal involved, and then the idea is, like, if you could explain the mechanism, and it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, but it's up to a point, because, like, how does this thing work? And it's like, nobody knows. Like we know how to manipulate things, but then it's like, and then you at some point you get to the bottom, and it's just like, yeah, and then it just does that. That's just what electricity does.
Yeah.
That's
What?
just what it conducts the current. And it's like, okay, so, and Lewis, actually, that's his definition of magic, is when you kind of reach a basic fact for which there is no further explanation.
Mhm.
Then so, and it's in Letters to Malcolm, where he talks about, if you carry this rock through the gate, then the wall will open of its own accord. And it's like, why? Or if you carry the flower through, it's like, why? It's just because it does. It's just because it does. Because that's what it is. And so Lewis thinks that's the definition of magic. He also thinks that science and magic are cousins.
Mm.
In Abolition of Man, he talks about how they were born of the same impulse at the same time, about this desire for mastery over nature, kind of the corruption of a dominion impulse, take control of nature. And it's like, that's why all of the chemists and the alchemists were the same people.
Yep.
The astronomers and the astrologers, it was the same people.
Yep.
And they were just trying different methods. And the astronomy worked in a way that astrology didn't. Chemistry worked in a way alchemy didn't. So one of them withered and died. And the other was successful. But at root, science and magic are the same impulse.
Yeah.
And that this is like, if you showed this to anybody in the ancient world, they'd be like, oh, you have a magic mirror.
Mm-hmm.
You have a magic mirror. Like, yeah, we've heard about those in our stories. There's a
Right.
magic mirror that allows you to see what's going on across the world. It's like, that's what you have, one of those. How'd you get the magic mirror? It's like, no, it's technology.
Yeah. Well, and even the mechanistic idea, I still think doesn't, like, create a strong distinction between the two, because if you look at anybody who practices magic or witchcraft or any sort of thing, like, it's ceremonies and rituals, like, it's processes, it's there are mechanisms they use to whatever ends that they're trying to achieve too. Like, it's fundamentally, like, just not different at all. It's like, what stuff are you using?
Pushing the button, like, right? Like, so you said that word, that's the equivalent of, I swiped on my iPhone and it saw my face and it unlocked. Like, you just did that we call it a password.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that language come from? It's like, oh, those old stories where it was like, you said something and the door opened.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right, that even there is a kind of, like, it's a manipulation of nature. The difference often is, to what degree do you think that the thing that you're engaging with is an agent, right? Are there other agencies in play here, so is the password a request of an agent or something like that, a power, versus something that we regard as more inert and is malleable by human construction. That's the kind of like basic. I think that's why people lump one into the other. If there's an agent involved, that's the fantasy side, that's magic. If it's just manipulating stuff, well, that plays more into that reductionism,
Yeah.
and is therefore materialistic.
Yeah. Well, when you get the chance, because I know you're like not a busy guy,
Yeah.
and listening to podcasts is probably super high on your list. But
Yeah.
we just dropped an episode called "Memes as Magic," where I talk about a lot of that, and I make the case that there's, at least a connection, like we're talking about here. So, and some people took it very seriously in some shocking ways. So, around the presidential election in 2016, so it's pretty fun. So, and we can be like a afternoon walk or something. So, well, I want to take some time here to look at another chapter as well, while we still got the time. I think it relates very clearly here, but chapter 9 is called Breaking Enchantments and Burnt Marshwiggle, Defending the Faith Against Modern Fables. So maybe you remember some of it off the top of your head, but essentially this is the scene where you've got and I think it's Eustace and
Eustace, Jill, and Puddleglum.
Jill and Puddleglum, right? And they're in Underland.
Yep.
With the green lady under her enchantment. So could you give us a little bit of a picture of what's going on there and kind of your argument?
Yeah, good. So, well, it's interesting because this is actually why I would say that even the language of enchantment or re-enchantment, I think from a Lewis frame, and it's one I agree with, isn't the best framing. And so, in the scene, Rillian's been under the enchantment. He's been chained to the silver chair. He's forgot who he is. He doesn't know it. They come down and release him from it, and then she walks in, right, just as he's been released from the enchantment, and then she goes to work on them. And the interesting thing, I've at some point this is a larger project, basically turning that chapter or a variation of that chapter into a book in and of itself on Puddleglum's faith. Because the interesting thing about the way Lewis presents it is that the spell that she tries to weave on them when she's putting them to sleep involves both words, arguments of some kind, but also kind of environmental factors, right? So she's playing the harp, she's thrown something in the fire that gives this sweet, sticky smell, and it gets into your blood and makes it hard to think. And so there's something in the air and something, in your ears that is a part of what makes these arguments effective. And then you have the arguments themselves, which is basically a kind of nothing buttery. Like she's arguing the nothing buttery position, right? So there's no sun. What is the sun? It's like a lamp. It's like, oh, you've just taken the lamp and you made a bigger and better lamp. Mm-hmm. What's a lion? A lion is just you've taken a cat and you've made a bigger and better cat. And you can hear kind of the Freudian, Feuerbachian, German atheism in the background of that, which has seeped its way into everything, which is that, religion is just basically projection. You had a father, as you grew up, you realized he wasn't as strong as you thought he was, and yet you still have that need for security. So you just project fatherhood and you get, daddy in the sky, which is kind of the caricature of all sorts. And so it's wish fulfillment, projection. That's the argument that she's making, and they're trying to resist. But part of what's interesting is that kind of what are the environmental conditions that make that plausible. And I think part of the answer would be something like our technologies catechize us in this way. Mm-hmm. They help us to orient toward reality as though it's matter that can be manipulated by humans, and humans are the only agencies. So we never encounter reality as a resistant thing to which we owe some kind of regard and which we have to cut with the grain of. Instead, everything is up for grabs. The extreme examples of this are kind of into the transgender stuff, where it's like even human nature, we can make a man into a woman simply by surgery and chemicals. And so that's kind of like, I think the background noise is our environment is one that is humanly constructed, which falsely teaches us that all of reality is Play-Doh and we can mold it however we want. If that's the case, then that includes not only the physical world, but also kind of our mental world. It's all projection. It's all human construction. It's all made up myths. And this is actually a place where I think there's an interesting shift, I guess you would call it, from like the new atheist who tended to be very brash and hostile to Christianity and organized religion in general, Dawkins and Hitchens and those guys, and what I would like to call, I tend to call like the nice atheists, which are the more contemporary one who tend to not have the same hostility, but they still operate from within that frame. So this is the evolutionary psychologists who try to explain modern human morality in terms of evolutionary history, or pseudo history. I even think guys like Jordan Peterson are kind of roughly in this category, where they want the myth, but they can't help but regard it as a myth, as something that humans have invented, and they recognize that it works, right? That this will help you in life, but when Peterson gets pressed, like, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? He really can't answer that question. He wants the story and he wants it to be potent, but to bring it into the realm of history would totally upend a lot of his assumptions about the world. And that's the one thing he can't yet do. So I think that this little scene is really interesting in that regard, because it's playing into, there's this background noise that is making these arguments seem more plausible than they actually are, which is part of what Puddleglum then does when he puts his foot in the fire, right? Which interrupts all of the background noise. Pain, in this case, is kind of the wake up. And then he actually does respond with arguments, all of which are, basically forms of Lewis's. It's the argument from reason, it's the argument from morality, it's the argument from meaning, it's the argument from beauty. It's his kind of go-to, which is, if we're just babies making up a game, the play world that we've invented licks your real world hollow. That's really strange. That cries out for some kind of explanation. Like, how did we invent? Well, it's the argument from desire. If we have this desire, it would be really strange if it didn't have any kind of fulfillment, if it was simply a desire pointed at nothing. And that's that. Then Lewis makes that argument formally in Mere Christianity and Miracles and other places. So I think that's what's really fascinating about this. Now, to the enchantment thing, part of why I think it's really interesting is that the modern kind of standard narrative is that the world used to be enchanted, gods and fairies and everything else. And then modernity came along, the Enlightenment came along, and it disenchanted the world, right? And so all of a sudden the enchantment died, and so we live in a disenchanted world. And then part of our task, part of what's happening, part of what you're talking about is sort of the re-enchantment of the world. And so you see people, Christians, talk this way, like, we need to re-enchant the world. The interesting thing to me, that framing, that narrative is itself the product of the Enlightenment, right? And the falsity to it, and this is why I think Lewis is particularly brilliant in it, is that Lewis doesn't think that the world got disenchanted. What Lewis thinks is the world got put under an enchantment, right? So like modernity itself is a kind of dark enchantment. It's before was normal, before was regular. It wasn't that you had sort of this inert matter that needed to be spiced up with enchantment. What you had was a rock, and you needed to like make it a magic rock. Like that's the modern thing, is that all you have is rocks, and then human beings project onto them magical qualities, and we enchant the world. And Lewis is like, no, the world just has these properties. That's baseline. The enchantment comes when you've been put under the dark enchantment, where you fall into nothing buttery, and all you see is the material components. And therefore, what we need is not to re-enchant. We need to break the enchantment.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I've heard Glenn Sunshine make a really similar argument, and I think that's right. I think that's probably what people mean oftentimes when they're talking about re-enchanting the world and things like that. But at the same time, too, like, how you frame things does matter. Right. And if you start going with, well, we got to re-enchant the world, you do run the risk of then trying to uncover things that actually should have not been uncovered too.
Right. And exactly. So that's the spirits. And it really does continue to play into that modern notion that, so it really is a non-enchanted world, and we have to do something to make it so, as opposed to the world that we're given is a world full of powers and agencies and all kinds of stuff. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that's just there. That's the given world. It doesn't need to be souped up.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. So
And so,
I've,
Lewis in the Weight of Glory, he talks about this as sort of like he uses a language of enchantment. He said we need because he asks at one point he's doing this kind of like um appeal to desire, the longing for you know not what, the scent of a flower you've never smelled, and the news from a country you've never visited. Um, and then he says, "Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tales. Spells are used to breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them.
yeah.
And we have the need of breaking the strongest enchantment that's sat over us for the last couple hundred years. All of our education, he calls it it's the enchantment of worldliness.
Hmm.
It's worldliness that is the kind of thing that has suffocated and lulled us to sleep. And he's trying to break the spell like Puddleglum does by appealing to this. There's this desire in you that's just there. You can't escape it. You can't get away from it. I know it's there, so I'm going to talk to it over the objections of your education and environment to try to draw it out. Because then you have to deal with it. What does it mean?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things you said earlier on kind of brought to mind something that I had been hearing in some different places and kind of toying with, and just a concept that I haven't really fleshed out yet, but the idea of like imaginative apologetics,
Mhm.
that imagination is going to have to play a really big part in how the church responds to this breaking of the enchantment, right? Because we want it to be broken and not just like shifted into something different,
Right.
adopting, the wrong kind of spirits. Because that
Yeah.
could really happen. That's really difficult for folks who don't think that kind of thing can happen to deal with, like, especially when they see it happening around them. But we have to figure out, and I think some of that was already there in some of the classical apologists, but how do we properly cast the right spell, if you will? I mean, that probably get
But
myself and yourself in trouble, but
no,
for
no,
using that phrasing. But
no, there. I think that's right. I mean, that's how Lewis thinks it. He's like, I'm trying to weave a spell. I guess perhaps I am. That is, and it's awakening longing, but it's also embedded in a kind of moral framework. So oftentimes, like what you're talking about, where people don't have the left hand, right hand path or whatever that was, like, um, there is a sort of latent amorality to it, or it's this kind of Pollyanna-ish that like all powers in the end must be good.
mm,
And so the idea of like, what if there's a dark power, it's a really interesting thing that when it comes time to like dabbling in this sort of stuff, that people turn to the kind of like, well, it can't be bad because, it's all benevolent. It's just different paths to the same destination. It's like, because all of the stories that they tell manifestly do not operate that way. Like horror movies, like that
mhm,
entire genre, very popular, is built on the idea that there are malevolent forces that want to destroy you,
mhm,
right? Oftentimes they oftentimes elevate those malevolent forces far higher, right? So it's still ostensibly taking place in a Christian frame. You've got priests and crosses and other things like that,
mhm.
but these dark forces are more powerful, right? They don't have this. They're not submitting to whatever the Christian imagery is. And so like people clearly have a moral framework for malevolent forces, but then all of a sudden just forget it when it comes
Yeah,
time to playing with their Ouija board. And
yeah,
it's like, yeah, but you realize that, and that if they do exist, that deception would be one of their main tactics. Like this
yeah,
would be a part, and it's like people just totally, no, they all the angel, it's an angel. He's talking to
yeah.
me. He says that everything's going to be okay. I just have to follow him.
Oh
And
yeah.
like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, you get that hit of participation in
Mhm.
something powerful, more powerful than yourself, or
Correct.
something just on the other side, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, that worked. And maybe particular to people in the United States is like very pragmatic, like, well,
Yeah.
that worked, so it must be good.
Yeah.
The thing happened that I wanted, so it must be good. Certainly it couldn't be bad, but man, there's
Right.
stuff on the other side just waiting to snag you. So
Right. Exactly right.
great.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on the podcast today. I know we're coming to the end of our time here. So,
Yeah.
is there anything else that you'd like to share with folks, or any places where people can find you?
I'm on X at Joe_Rigney. Canon Plus is kind of where I'm camped out. I got a lot of old articles at Desiring God still. So if you want to go find those, you mentioned I've written a bunch of books, you can go track those down. But kind of the regular spot for it now is all at Canon Plus.
Great. All right. Well, as everybody knows, we've got links in the description to the podcast for Discord, which is great. You're welcome to join as well, Joe, if you want to get a little taste of the weird. And we've got our merch store in the link, all of the things that you want, as well as Twitter and things like that. So appreciate you coming on. As always, stay tethered, everyone, and thanks for listening.